The intent of this video is to discuss how to calculate and identify significant figures or significant digits, or in short, sig figs. So what are significant figures? They are a measurement of uncertainty, essentially. It tells us about how certain we are in an instrument's ability to measure a mass or a distance or a time. So let's say you wanted to weigh something out in chemistry lab and you walked over to the balance and you saw the little display on the balance and it gave you a mass of 1 gram, okay? And you knew because you saw on the side of the balance that this balance is accurate to plus or minus 0.01 gram, okay? So you go back to your lab notebook now that you've weighed this out and you know that it's 1 gram of material. And if you were to write down in your lab notebook that you had 1.0 gram, you're actually underestimating how precise that balance was. If you were to go back to your notebook and write down that it weighed 1.000 gram, you're actually overestimating how precise that instrument is, okay? So it kind of shows the significance of significant figures. All right, so there are some rules for determining significant figures. And the very first rule, they're in your book, it's on towards the end of page 124, but the very first rule has to deal with non-zero integers. So all non-zero integers, 1 through 9, are significant. So those are significant. Really, when it gets to significant figures, the trickiest thing you have to decide is if there's a 0 in the number, is it significant or not? Okay, so when we look at zeros, there's usually 3 types of places a 0 can be. A 0 can be between 2 numbers, like let's say it was number 207, right? So if that 0 is in between 2 non-zero integers, that 0 is significant. Check. Then we have what we call leading and trailing zeros. Leading zeros lead up to a number. So if I wanted to write the number 73, I could put a bunch of zeros in front of it leading up to that number. Are these zeros significant? No, they are not significant. So leading zeros, even if you were to have a leading 0 after a decimal place, in a number like this, all of these numbers are leading up to your very first actual number, and those are all not significant. They're placeholders, honestly, right? Those are just placeholders. But then we have the trailing zeros, and that's where there's like 1 or 2 extra little rules about it. Okay, so let's look at trailing zeros. So when I say trailing zeros, what I mean is I'm talking about zeros that come after a number. So if we look at a couple examples, and let me make up another number. And the last one, okay, so here's just some numbers that I made up. And so when we are talking about trailing zeros, we're talking about zeros that come after the last non-zero integer or non-zero number. So in this first example, I'm talking about these 2 zeros right here. In this example, I'm talking about this 0 right here. In this example, I'm talking about these 2 zeros right here. In this example, I'm talking about these 2 zeros right here. And in this example, I'm talking about these last 3 zeros right here. You see, remember, these are leading zeros and they're not significant. We just talked about that. So those don't count as significant figures. But let's take a look at these examples and discuss the rules about trailing zeros as significant figures. So if there is no decimal place and it's a whole number, right? So no decimal place and the trailing zeros are not significant. I know that doesn't sound like it makes a lot of sense, but the reason that is because this number could have been rounded. Okay, so instead of 73,200, maybe the number was actually 73,152. And then that number got rounded up to 73,200. Okay, so that's kind of like, that's the difference in those significant figures there. So these zeros that are not, if there's no decimal place, these are not significant. Think of rounding, like somebody rounded that number. So they're not sure what those last two zeros actually are. But if you were to place a decimal place, then that number becomes significant. That actual number is, that's a zero there, like for sure. This number didn't used to be 18, it was 20. So is that zero significant? Yes, that is actually a significant figure. Any trailing zeros that occur after a decimal place, so in this example, and in this example, and in this last example, those are all significant. Okay, so significant, significant, significant. So for the most part, a lot of, I'd say most trailing zeros are significant, but the only exception is this kind of rule up here, where if we're talking about numbers to the left of it, there's no decimal place, like big whole numbers that we're familiar with, and there's no decimal, any trailing zeros are not significant. If you put a decimal place there, they become significant. Okay, and any zeros that are trailing and after a decimal place are significant. So let's go through and calculate the total number of significant figures in these numbers right here that I've made up. So in this very first number, I have, let me get my, I guess I'll get a little green highlighter. All right, so the 7 is significant, the 3 is significant, the 2 is significant, but those two zeros were not significant. So this has 3 significant figures. What about my next example? Whole number 1, totally significant. Look at there, here's our 0, but remember it's a 0 that's in between two non-zero integers. So yeah, that's significant. That's significant, that's significant. Oh, and then, what's going on with this 0? Oh, there was the period there. So we know that's actually, we're certain about that 0. So that becomes a significant number. And that gives us a total of 5 significant digits for that value. If you look at the next one, remember all non-zero integers are significant. And then we have these two zeros that are trailing zeros after a decimal place. So those two are significant. So we have, again, 5 significant figures there. Next example, our 2 is significant. It's a non-zero integer. And then remember, these trailing zeros come after a decimal place, so all of them become significant. So we have 3 here. And last but not least, this value down here. So remember, we had said that leading zeros are not significant. So none of these zeros count for anything. But the very first number starts our significant value. So that 3 is significant. That 2, that 7, those are all non-zero integers. And then we have our trailing zeros that come after a decimal place. So all 3 of those are significant. And that would give you a total of 6 significant figures. So practice some more with significant figures. You can work on the homework and also do some more of the your turn questions in the book.